Gracias. Right, so welcome everyone. Welcome back. I hope that you are liking the venue. I think that this is quite a special one. So yeah, let's get into it. We're going to start with panel 3, which is titled 19th Century, Playwrights, Manageresses, and Producers. It has been really difficult to organize the panels because we have so many interesting papers and so many different topics. But I think that this is a good one. So our next speaker is, and I hope I can pronounce this, Magret Berger, from the University of Vienna. She is a German studies graduate with a special focus on Austrian theatre and playwright in the 19th century. And she's now a PhD candidate in history at the University of Vienna. She is currently researching her dissertation project, which is titled Mobile Women Theatre Life, Women Theatre Managers in the Hamburg Monarchy, 1850-1940, at the Center for Historical Migration Research and the Institute for Rural History. Her research interests include theatre, social and women's history, as well as mobility, and biographical research in the temporal context of the 19th century. So, thank you very much. The floor is yours.
Yeah, many thanks for the very kind introduction, and I'm very pleased to be here and to be able to speak about Josefine Gallmeyer's time as theatre manager and her entrepreneurial activities. But first, let's have a brief look at the German-speaking theatre landscape in the 19th century. Its reach was far greater than the German-speaking areas of Central Europe. As we can see on this map, it was of a global range. But by using theatre almanacs as source material, we can also trace the itineraries of theatre managers which towns they visited and performed at. And what we also discover is that there were many women who ran theatres which were not considered in theatre historiography at all. But through combining the information from almanacs with archival and historical sources, with a colleague, we have already found more than 130 female managers for what is only today's Austria. So against all odds, they were indeed active throughout the century, and just as Tracy C. Davies proclaimed for the British stage, in the same era, in every corner, every kind of neighborhood, and every sized town, burg and city, women ran this industry. However, the professional activity of female theatre managers in the German-speaking theatre in the 19th century Habsburg monarchy has so far received little attention. So in my PhD project, I focus on these women who ran professional theatre companies and were active in any form of artistic and operational leadership positions, since their manifold activities as entrepreneurs, directors, VCs and owners have so far remained unconsidered in theatre historiography. The project aims to make these women visible. By analyzing the life and work practices of these women, I ask how they came to hold management positions, what their practice and scope of action looked like, and whether they had opportunities for advancement in a male-dominated sphere of work. In my project, I will analyze and compare a handful of female managers who were active at the same time, but positioned at different spaces in the theatre landscape. That means some were managing bigger stages, even in Vienna, but others smaller stages in the Habsburg provincial cities, and others led even small traveling companies. Josefine Gallmeyer, the main protagonist for my paper today, was certainly one of the former. She was a very famous Viennese actress and is widely known as soubrette, folk singer and dancer, having a long and successful career. But she also managed a theatre, and this side of hers, being a businesswoman, has received hardly any attention so far. I will present insights of my micro-historical examination of this exceptional artist and will examine two essential aspects of her activity as an artist and theatre manager on the basis of self-testimonies and media coverage. Firstly, I will focus on the period where she managed the Travelogues in Vienna, and secondly, I will introduce a form of entrepreneurship where she successfully managed her guest performances in the US. Josefine Gallmeyer was born in 1838, coincidentally in Leipzig, Germany, because her Viennese mother just gave a guest performance there. She descends from a traditional theatre family whose members played at renowned stages, so she made her own debut at the age of 15 in Brno in the Czech Republic, initially against the wishes of her parents. But she quickly made a name for herself and was very popular and liked by the audience. Here we can see the international span of her remarkable career, where she performed all over Europe, but also in the United States. That also demonstrates how the lives of theatre people are permeated by mobility and migration. And these were the places she performed in Europe, where the era of the Habsburg monarchy is highlighted in red. She soon got a nickname, Die Fesche Peppi, from the theatre manager Friedrich Stampfer. In Austria, Peppi is short for Josefine, and Fesch means something like dashing or posh. She took over the name, and some of her writings are signed with this nickname phrase, perhaps for the purpose of self-marketing. Based on her self-testimonies, but also on the media portrayal and reception of her person, the image of a strong, tough, emancipated woman can be traced. She was considered very quick-tempered and wild. Other descriptions of her as a person were tomboyish, frivolous, funny, and quirky. In addition to her impressive career as an actress, she was also active as a theatre manager. Even though her managerial activities didn't last for a long time, her handwritten records of these periods give a concrete insight into her leadership, ambition, and managerial activities, while historical media reports also allow a contrasting perspective. Already in the 1860s, there were rumors that Gallmeyer wanted to become a theatre manager. According to reports, in 1869 she was planning to apply for the managership of the German theatre in Budapest together with Moritz Moorländer, where she had often performed in guest appearances. In an article, an author commented rather cynical, "It is to be wished that the manager Gallmeyer engages a member just being like the singer Gallmeyer, so that she finally meets a just punishment for the many bitter hours she caused her directors. Therefore, may she only become directress. There is no better nemesis for her." This shows that she was already perceived as an ambivalent and stubborn, almost unmanageable character at this point. In any case, at this time, it has not yet worked out with the management takeover. Finally, in September 1874, she, together with a male co-manager, the playwright Julius Rosen, took over the management of the Viennese Theater, as it was already announced at the beginning of the year. At this time, a deposit has already been made and contracts negotiated and completed with artistic personnel for the season ahead. One newspaper announced, "Directrice Gallmeyer will take the reins of the stage." Another one wrote, "In September, the dashing Peppi begins her regiment at the Theater, and Rosen's suffering will also begin." Interestingly, in this management constellation with Julius Rosen, Gallmeyer is clearly framed as, let's say, the boss, the leader. On January 1874, the contract between Stampfer, Gallmeyer, and Rosen was signed. The annual lease was to be 17,500 gulden. Today, this would be about 245,000 euros. And the contract also stated that they agreed to keep the name of the theatre, named after the founder Friedrich Stampfer in 1871. The Stampfer Theater was located in Vienna's first district in a very good neighborhood, and in 1874 the concession for all genres of theatrical performances was given to Gallmeyer and Rosen. Above all, however, they staged operetta, farce, comedy, and parody. Here we have a contract between the management Gallmeyer Rosen and the composer Eduard Bremser, and this is her handwriting, by the way. The contract is not very exciting. It defines the number and type of compositions he had to deliver annually. But the interesting thing about is that the contract was signed in February 1874, nearly 8 months before the season opening. Both Gallmeyer and Rosen signed, so they had already planned and arranged it in advance. It shows the long and meticulous preparation for the upcoming season. The new theatre season opened under the Gallmeyer-Rosen management in September, and the premiere play was written by her business partner and the playwright Julius Rosen, in which she herself also participated and spoke the prologue in Viennese dialect. And there was extensive media coverage of the opening. For example, the Theater unter den Tuchlauben celebrated its opening yesterday. The house, which has gained in furnishings, was full and the audience applauded proficiently. Gallmeyer spoke superbly a prologue made by Rosen and was frequently interrupted by applause. It was even said that she was a born manageress, so the premiere as a manager went excellently. The public audience and critics were optimistic about the new management, and after the successful start, things also went very well. Even in the next month, the performances were completely sold out, and among the visitors were regular guests from the Habsburg aristocracy. In media coverage, time and again, Gallmeyer is praised as a truly virtuous artist and for her worthful performances. Gallmeyer was frequently seen in a leading role. In December, the new management celebrated its 100th performance of the season, and Gallmeyer was on stage in every one of those days in addition to her duties as a manager, indicating a hard-working artist and entrepreneur. It seems that the artistic direction of the theatre by Gallmeyer-Rosen was extremely successful. The critics were praiseful, the audience was satisfied, and the plays were well attended. From this perspective, everything seemed to be in good condition. However, behind the curtains, in the background, the opposite was true. The financial and economic side had not been managed so well by them. There is evidence in the records that there were excessive expenses that could not be covered. The financial conditions and basis to keep the theatre operational was more and more problematic, and the danger was already particularly great in January 1875. Although there were still hints of further planning, for example, they purchased new pieces and rehearsed. Gallmeyer's financial situation as a private person was just as bad. She was already heavily in debt, which certainly affected the theatre business too. This situation can be explained with how commercial German-speaking theatre business operations worked. The theatre manager, in German der Theaterdirektor, was fully responsible for all artistic and operational aspects of the theatre. That meant an extreme amount of responsibility rested exclusively with the managers. They were private entrepreneurs who only leased the theatre building and usually didn't receive any public subsidies from the city or state. They had to bring everything themselves. A successful theatre manager therefore had to bring experience, capital, his own repertoire of plays called library, and decoration. In addition, in the best case, he or she was also bringing in family members in certain positions within the theatre business, which were cheap labor. Gallmeyer and Rosen had none of that. Most importantly, they had no theatre management experience, and instead of capital, lots of debts. The contract should have lasted for 6 years, but already after 6 months after the takeover, they weren't able to continue the theatre operations. To make matters worse, Gallmeyer fell ill in January-February, and while being the figurehead of the acting personnel, she was unable to attend many of her performances. She also fell out with the co-manager Rosen, which had finally ended their joint managership. She then accepted an offer from the Komische Oper in Vienna and was an ensemble member starting 2 months later in April 1875. The manager of the Komische Oper lured away more renowned members as well. So Gallmeyer's career as a theater manager ended quite abruptly, but certainly not her entrepreneurial activity within the theater world. She self-managed guest performance tours had always been important in her career. In the early 1880s, she started touring the US. With these performances overseas, she planned to improve and rehabilitate her financial situation. From my research experience working on female theater managers in the 19th century, it is evident that women in managerial positions were often ignored in theater historiography, but often also during the active time in a male-dominated sphere. Even if women were involved in theater management or any form of business activity, these aspects tend to be excluded. And in co-management situations, the company's successes usually get attributed only to the male partner. To uncover their wide-ranging contributions in the business side of theater, it calls for a special methodology. That means indirect approaches are needed. Other source materials might be relevant even if they are sometimes not connected to theater. Sources must be read against the grain, and specific patterns in them have to be unlocked and decoded. And as well, managerial activity has to be defined in a more broader sense, because it might often be less informative to only look at who is mentioned as a theater manager in the almanacs, for example. In the almanacs, women, and in particular wives of theater managers, often appear as cashiers, which regularly is a reliable indication of a managerial co-activity and shows the importance in theater businesses as the economical side in the core of any successful company. And now to come back to Gallmeyer, it is also useful to think about her managerial activity more broadly for understanding her career. Especially by reading Gallmeyer's numerous travelogues, it shows how skilled she was in self-promotion and what enormous power she had in negotiating deals. Of particular interest is the phase of her stays in the US. In the years 1882 and 1883, Gallmeyer was touring the United States and visited cities such as New York, Baltimore, St. Louis, Indianapolis, and Philadelphia. For example, she got a contract including free lodging in a first-class hotel and 55,000 marks in cash, today about 400,000 euros, for a 5-month stay. Due to her status within the theatrical landscape, she was able to independently determine and manage her career path. Here we see an entry from a theater almanac for the year 1882, documenting her guest performances at the well-known Thalia Theater in New York. According to the entry, this theater was affiliated with the German theater in Philadelphia, showing that the whole network of German-speaking theater existed then. And we also get the information about the management. Karl Hermann was the manager and Heinrich Conried the artistic manager. The Thalia Theater was a playhouse in the Lower East Side of Manhattan and is today commonly referred to as the Bowery Theater. It was known under different names and especially in the 1880s under ownership of the Germans and Austrians Gustav Amberg, Heinrich Conried and Mathilde Cotrelli. It was the theater for German-speaking productions in New York. At this time, other German and Austrian actors and actresses were also successfully touring the US, such as Kathi Schratt, Marie Geistinger and Adolf Sonnenthal, all well known from Vienna's most renowned stages. Heinrich Conried repeatedly recruited German-speaking actors for guest appearances in New York, who made the trip overseas by steamship. After Gallmeyer arrived in New York, however, she criticized the working conditions under Conried. In 4 paragraphs, she complained about the manager and accuses him of lying because he had promised her a contract with the same conditions as another Austrian actress, but had not kept this agreement. And Heinrich Conried was at the time artistic manager at the Thalia Theater. In the complaint, we also get insight into the usual practice of the guest performance, which accordingly turned out to be uncomfortable and less glamorous. She further wrote, "I was persuaded to play right after the day of my arrival, and the same evening of my arrival I had to go to the rehearsal. So I did not have time to recover from the long journey, and now I am ill as a result. The management had not prepared anything for my guest performance." These are just a few examples demonstrating that these are just a few examples demonstrating that she did never shy away from voicing grievances and also contractual disadvantages, and to speak and stand up for herself. She could also afford it because she was a celebrated star at home and abroad, and the managers therefore put a lot of effort into attracting her to the stage. And despite her Stammtheater's misery, she was always a celebrated star in demand. There are numerous of letters with well-known theater managers, such as Heinrich Laube in Vienna, showing that they were willing to win her as an actress. And also the media reports from the US show her popularity, but there might not be enough time to talk about this. So, for the conclusion, I want to come back to these questions that are important in my PhD project. First, what enabled women to manage theaters, and what was the scope of action? So, from another perspective, Gallmeyer's status as an acclaimed star allowed a specific behavior, and therefore she had a completely different scope of action than the majority of women within the theater industry. This opened up entrepreneurial possibilities for her, for example, to manage even bigger theater stages, such as the Stammtheater, which would have been inaccessible for women at the time, who almost always got into management positions by inheriting theater operation from family members. The few exceptions are, it seems to me, when women had great capital, as for example Alexandrine von Grünerer, who managed the renowned theater Under Wien in Vienna, or when they, usually building on a career as actresses, acquired a certain status within the theater world, where their economic potential was plain to see. Then women gained power and were able to reach certain positions in the industry that were normally reserved for men. So there were no pathways for women into the management of bigger theaters, but only these exceptions. The norm was, however, as I said, that leadership opportunities for women were limited to what could be called the peripheral or fringe spaces within the theater landscape. For example, at smaller stages in the outskirts of cities or at traveling theater companies. There was probably less competition, but the working conditions were precarious, and this was a less respected practice with no real opportunities for social mobility. And the second question towards an expanded idea of entrepreneurial activity might also be explained with this very many female managers that were, unlike Gallmeyer, managing only small theater operations in peripheral spaces. As information about the marginalized practices and scars, I looked more closely at the family networks to uncover the division of work within theater operations that are almost exclusively attributed to one male family head, but that could not exist without the whole family and their labor. In some cases, it becomes clear that especially wives were co-managing these theaters for years, sometimes decades, without being credited for it. So for most of my protagonists, there are very few sources, and I have to dive deep, and a lot of source and archival work is still necessary to uncover these women and their stories. In the case of Gallmeyer, however, the problem is not that there are no sources, quite the contrary. There is still so much to explore in the materials of Gallmeyer, and I'm still at the beginning examining her interesting career and life.
Thank you very much. Our final speaker is Amanda Nelson from Virginia Tech. Dr. Amanda Nelson joined the faculty of Virginia Tech in 2013 to develop a new MFA program in arts leadership. She previously worked 11 years for the world-renowned Alvin Ailey American Theatre in New York City. She holds a PhD in drama from Tufts University, an MA in drama from San Francisco State University, and a BA in drama from the University of California. While in graduate school, her scholarship centered on Victorian women playwrights and actresses. The paper proposed for this conference is part of her current sabbatical research on Victorian women actor managers and producers. So whenever you're ready, thank you very much, Amanda.
Let me know if you can't hear me. I can project. Performing management through her pen. Minnie Maddern Fiske as producer and activist. Sure. All right, be ready, because suddenly I'm going to project. Prologue. A Victorian woman in a new woman world. Bosh, called out Mrs. Fiske. This exclamation did not surprise drama critic Alexander Wolcott, as he had heard her use the expression before. With her flaming red hair and piercing eyes, her presence on stage and off was striking. In the opening of his 1917 book, Mrs. Fiske, her views on actors, acting, and the problems of production, Wolcott describes his subject sitting before him as, quote, vital, alert, indefatigable, eloquently animate, with mutinous, gleaming humor, and utter self-effacement, unquote. Minnie Maddern Fiske, 1865 to 1932, was a performer from childhood. While she is perhaps most well known for bringing Henrik Ibsen to the American stage as an actress, her contributions extend far beyond the footlights. When she married theatrical manager Harrison Gray Fiske in 1890, she took his name, but became a theatrical producer in her own right. Weaving primary and secondary source material, this paper explores the contributions of Minnie Maddern Fiske as theater producer and activist. Close examination of her correspondence reveals an adroitness in wielding her pen to flex her leadership. This enterprising woman theater maker led, advocated, and agitated for herself, her theater company, and the social causes she championed. Her early biography reads like a dramatic work she might produce for the stage. Christened Maria Augusta Davy, Minnie Maddern was born into a New Orleans theatrical family and spent her childhood touring the United States. Her parents divorced, and it was her grandmother, along with her mother, aunt, and uncle, who formed an extended theatrical family, teaching young Minnie the trade and doing their best to prepare her for a life on stage. Then, in 1879, her mother passed away, leaving Minnie Maddern impoverished and alone. Both published biographical works and private letters reveal Minnie Maddern's trepidation about being able to support herself through a career on stage. Her biographer Archie Binns notes, quote, she was born in relative poverty and died in the same, unquote. A Victorian upbringing and new woman opportunities. As Pamela Coburn reminds us in her book, Winning the Vote to Directing on Broadway, quote, at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th, women both created and were caught within performances of contradictions. Culturally, women were still tied to Victorian values, yet politically, this period saw a push to challenge the limitations of traditional roles, unquote. While being part of the theatrical family placed Minnie Maddern outside of the many social norms of the time, she was not immune to the strict Victorian social expectations that govern life on stage and off. Her marriage to Harrison Gray Fiske in 1890 was both conventional. She took his name and formally retired from the stage for a time, and unconventional, as this husband and wife would become business partners in theatrical enterprises until her death in 1932. During Mrs. Fiske's 3-year retirement from the stage, she struggled with domesticity and was ambivalent about having children. Biographer Archer Binns describes the Fiske home as being, quote, caught in the quiet of a storm center, a conflict electric enough to be felt in every room. Mrs. Fiske had undertaken a role for which she was unsuited, unquote. A few notes on letter writing in the long 19th century. Letter writing was the central mode of communication across geographical distance throughout the long 19th century. And according to Dr. Deirdre Mahoney, its burdens fell largely to the women. Now, beginning in the mid-19th century, epistolary etiquette guidance was offered through popular books sold, and penning was studied by both men and women. Writers were encouraged to keep letters conversational, and the main stricture on content related to tone and temper. The letter represented an extension of female decorum. As a result, respectable women did not express capricious sentiment or improper hostility, much less anger. Mahoney recognizes that letter writing also provided a platform of sorts to the Victorian woman. Quote, letter writing provided a stage, somewhere between a public and private setting, for a graceful performance demonstrating taste and refined manners. A private sphere activity, condoned as appropriately feminine, allowed women limited and sanctioned entrance into the public sphere, unquote. In their book, Letter Writing as a Social Practice, literary scholars David Barton and Nigel Hall explain, quote, as a carrier for text, the letter can be used to mediate a huge range of human interactions. Through letters, one can narrate experiences, dispute points, describe situations, offer explanations, give instructions, and so on, unquote. Of specific note and relevance to my argument that Minnie Maddern Fiske performed management through her pen is Barton and Hall's assertion that, quote, in letter writing, there are distinct roles, beginning with the writer and the reader, and many relationships between writer and reader reflect unequal relationships of power, unquote. The letters discussed in this paper cast Minnie Maddern Fiske in the role of writer and Harrison Ray Fiske as reader, performing management through her pen. As was typical of the epistolary practices of her time, her letters to her husband and business partner Harrison are conversational in tone. Many read as though the two Fiskes are in a room together discussing their business affairs, with interjections revealing the very personal nature of their partnership. She addressed Harrison with her pet names for him, like Dearest Boise or Darling Boy, and she closed her letters with sweet valedictions and his pet names for her, Dearest One, Bunner, or Dearest Love, Darling Boy, Bunnikin. In the letters contained in the Library of Congress collection, some letters are handwritten, others are typed. Many letters indicate that Minnie Maddern Fiske took the time to review and edit her letters to her husband. Words are crossed out and replaced, keywords are underlined, further thoughts are written in the margins, and postscripts are added. In The Business of Letter Writing, author Michael Zakem explains that in the late 19th century, business correspondence was the male equivalent of sewing, a traditional skill, unquote. As evidenced by the plethora of letters penned by Mrs. Fiske while on tour, she often took on the traditionally male role of business correspondent, writing almost daily, sometimes twice a day, to Harrison, sending tour updates, reporting on box office receipts, noting audience and critic responses, as well as offering suggestions regarding planning for the next or future tours. A close examination of her correspondence with her husband demonstrates how she managed theatrical productions with and through her husband. On fixed stop stationery from the Plaza Hotel in Danville, Illinois, Minnie mused to Harrison, quote, it seems to me that the second route is perhaps the most advantageous as it takes in more places, does it not? We should, however, try to place Sioux City, Des Moines, and Wichita. They are all fine towns for us. Why not try to include them? San Diego is good. We should try to play Santa Barbara. It should be fine. Why not Santa Barbara instead of Bakersfield? Bakersfield is no good at all. After St. Paul, I suggest Chicago, Cleveland, Indianapolis, Columbus, Detroit, Grand Rapids, unquote. Fiske was expert in the performance of decorum. Her acting manager, Frank Carlos Griffith, proclaimed, "Had Mrs. Fiske been born a man, she would have made a great diplomat, for tact is one of the most prominent branches of her tree of attainment," unquote. She navigates the role of wife and producer carefully, threading a needle between asserting her ideas and acquiescing to Harrison. In 1908, from her hotel in Waterloo, Iowa, Mrs. Fiske wrote a 17-page handwritten letter to Harrison. Conversational in style, but serious and urgent in tone and content, the letter is evidence of Minnie Maddern Fiske's lifelong fear of poverty. Quote, "And now there's another thing I wish to speak of. I think I should speak of it now. We must remember that the years are passing. After 12 years of hard and incessant work and considerable success, we find ourselves with nothing. I do not say this in a gloomy or discouraging way, but it is time we become very prudent. It is well to be optimistic and cheerful and carefree under stress, but it is better to be prudent at our age. We must avoid a poverty-stricken old age," unquote. She continues on for a number of pages with pleas and prudence for planning. She points out that her tours have been financially successful and that the financial losses stem from productions of the Manhattan Theater in New York City, which was managed primarily by her husband, Harrison. And she points out, and as she points out this failure, she also reassures Harrison with, quote, "For 10 years, we have not had a losing season in our joint work. We have worked in accord and been helpful to each other," unquote. The last several pages of the letter reiterate her concerns. "We are both middle-aged," she was 42 at the time. "What will become of us if we are always in financial distress? I have a horror of an old age of financial distress and all the humiliation it brings. Let us determine to avoid it now," unquote. She had experienced poverty and hardship in childhood and was determined to have a different future. The year 1911 seems to have been a year of ups and downs for Minnie Maddern Fiske and her touring company. Much of the correspondence she wrote to Harrison chronicled challenges from logistics to box office receipts. From Peoria, Illinois, she attempts to assuage Harrison while directing him to heed her business advice. Quote, "Darling, dear, precious Boise, your telegram came yesterday, darling boy. I answered you in the night letter, advising you not to give the Wednesday matinee in Brooklyn. 3 matinees would be too many. It would only divide up the business and cause us to play the very light houses, which would be bad for the engagement. Please ask them to omit the Wednesday matinee. It would be a useless waste of time to give it. I'm so very sorry that business is not better here and in Bloomington. I hope for better things when we get out of the Chicago belt. I hope all goes well with you, precious Boise. Dearest love, Bunnigan." Her pen, mightier than the sword. Between 1896 and 1910, a time of intense touring activity for Mrs. Fiske, the Theatrical Syndicate, a powerful conglomerate of 6 men, dominated American theater, controlling theater bookings across the United States. As theater historian Steve Travis explains, quote, "The activities of the syndicate were a major source of controversy in America at the turn of the century. There was no neutral ground. One faction believed that the syndicate had saved the theater by standardizing bookings, and the other that the syndicate was a greedy octopus, which would eventually destroy the theater," unquote. To the Fiskes, the syndicate was a monopoly that stifled artistic work and limited theater companies. Harrison Fiske was suspicious of the syndicate from the start. Minnie Maddern Fiske soon joined her husband in what was to become a crusade against it. The syndicate was a Goliath. Their battle with the Fiskes included an 1897 libel suit against Harrison, which was openly welcomed by them because they believed the suit would bring to light the peril of the syndicate to other producers, managers, and actors. Against the first organized revolt against the theatrical syndicate, the suit did ignite several prominent actors to join the Fiske's revolt. In 1898, 7 stars of the American stage, including Minnie Maddern Fiske, penned and then signed a pact, which, under its terms, none of the signers were permitted to book through an agency of any kind on penalty of a $5,000 forfeit, unquote. While applauded for their efforts by the press, the realities of the financial power of the syndicate eroded the spirit of the pact, and one by one the actors left, leaving only Mrs. Fiske and her pen to do battle. During this period, Minnie Maddern Fiske and her company performed in the few independent theaters that existed, as well as in tents and convention halls, and even in roller skating rinks. Her letters to Harrison often hint at the tensions and challenges of being under the thumb of the syndicate. One of her 1908 tour letters to Harrison opens with, quote, "Darling boy, first I want to speak to you of this little theater here. I met the owner and manager last night. They are going to operate the theater independently, and they are building their hopes that you will speak to the theater, to Mr. Schubert and Mr. Velasco, and influence them to send their attractions here when possible. They are so sincere in their independence that I really think it's our duty to help them all we can. They want to keep independent," unquote. Interestingly, it would ultimately be the Schubert brothers who, in 1910, would form their own conglomerate, which would eventually lead to the downfall of the original theatrical syndicate. But the effects of the theatrical syndicate were felt by the Fiskes for some time. The financial repercussions of battling Goliath followed Mrs. Fiske's company into its 1911 tour. Quote, "Darling boy, the more I think of it, the more I feel we should try not to close our season, as I fear the closing of the tour would perhaps have a black eye effect. It would go over the country that we had closed, and if the break in the tour can be avoided, do you not think we had better avoid it?" Unquote. Penning advocacy. Mrs. Fiske's management included new play development. While she authored a number of plays herself, it was the nurturing of and advocating for new talent for which she was recognized. American playwright Lawrence Ayr was one who benefited from Mrs. Fiske's keen eye and dramaturgical talent. His papers are part of the collection at the New York Public Library, and in an introduction to the collection of his correspondence with Mrs. Fiske, he notes, quote, "Mrs. Fiske sought out the work of native dramatists, read them, encouraged them, and often produced them with good results," unquote. Telegrams, his collection of letters, postcards, and telegrams from Mrs. Fiske is quite extensive, revealing a long-term commitment from Mrs. Fiske as a mentor and guide to him. Her correspondence provides dramaturgical feedback and thoughtful criticism, suggested edits, and ongoing encouragement. Ayer's own notes included in the collection are reflections of his professional alliance and allegiance with Mrs. Fiske. He writes, "For many years I kept sending Mrs. Fiske my plays to read, and she was always interested and encouraging," unquote. One of Ayer's plays that was successful for him and Mrs. Fiske was Miss Nellie of New Orleans, described in publicity as a comedy of moonshine, madness, and make-believe. While Ayr is credited as playwright and Harrison as director of the production, Minnie Maddern Fiske's letters to Ayr show that she had a strong hand in writing of the play, from plot points and character development to the design and staging of the play. The success of his play, Miss Nellie, was more the exception for Ayr than the rule, and many letters from Mrs. Fiske offer constant encouragement. "You know enough of theater to know what immense patience we all have to have in these matters, but it has always been my experience that the wished-for thing always comes eventually," unquote. Minnie Maddern Fiske's advocacy went well beyond the theater. She was a staunch advocate for animal welfare. The fashion trends of the day included plumed hats and fur stoles, and Minnie Maddern Fiske used her celebrity and wielded her pen for the humane treatment of these animals. She was heavily involved in a campaign to protect the egret. Quote, "Ornithologists had written them off as doomed to extinction at the hands of the plume hunters, and when Mrs. Fiske had done her work, no woman in America would have been found dead wearing an egret, and the birds were multiplying by the thousands," unquote. And when the fur trade gifted Mrs. Calvin Coolidge a fur to wear, Mrs. Fiske picked up her pen and wrote directly to the First Lady, quote, "We feel they have struck the most vital blow at our cause already in making you their innocent advertiser. We know the women of this land worship you and that they seek to emulate you. We would not pursue to say what you should do, but we feel that your great heart will give you the best answer and you will arrive at the right decision." Unquote. Bullfighting was another animal wrong Mrs. Fiske sought to right. She recognized the power of celebrity in the causes she supported and again picked up her pen to agitate. Jane Addams, of Hull Hall's fame, had offhandedly mentioned to her that she was going to be having a trip to Mexico. Again, Mrs. Fiske picked up her pen. Quote, "Let me tell you, my dear Miss Addams, that in Mexico the most incredible treatment of dumb animals still prevails. The whole purpose of this letter is to ask you that if you have the opportunity to say some little word in Mexico to the effect that you hope bullfighting may come day be abolished there, such an expression from you would be gain force day by day." Unquote. Postscript. The long 19th century closes and a new one begins. Mrs. Fiske would often profess to be hopelessly modern, and in many ways, Minnie Maddern Fiske was. She was a professional, an actor, a playwright, a producer, a stage manager. She fought the theatrical syndicate, and she was a fierce advocate for animal rights. Yet she did not refer to herself as a new woman, and unlike others in her field, she had not been a suffragist. But in 1928, 8 years after women's suffrage in the United States, Mrs. Fiske again took out her pen and wrote a letter. This time, she wrote a letter to the chairman of the Democratic National Committee, who at that time was Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Quote, "This year, for the first time, circumstances will permit me to participate in a presidential election." Unquote. While I found ample evidence of Mrs. Fiske's interest in the business affairs of her company's tours and her letters to her husband, in his book, in 1912, her acting manager, Frank Carlos Griffith, describes a very different persona. Quote, "She never has a box office statement or a statement of the week, almost never inquires about the house. It is the same with respects to handling business details." Unquote. Mr. Griffith seems to be describing a proper Victorian lady, and perhaps she performed that role in his presence. Minnie Maddern Fiske, Mrs. Fiske in the public realm, embodies Pamela Corbin's performance of contradictions, as she lived and worked in that space between Victorian ideals and New Women ideas. Playwright Lawrence Eyre observed, "As business partners, Harrison Ray Fiske and Minnie Maddern Fiske made an ideal combination. They supplemented each other. I do not know if there was an understanding as to the territory to be covered by either. To his side of the task brought education and taste, and to hers, Mrs. Fiske brought practical working knowledge of the theater, imagination, courage, and immense vitality." Unquote. I imagine that if Minnie Maddern Fiske had heard this praise, she might have responded with a dramatic and rather self-effacing bosh.
Thank you very much. We are running a little bit late, so we have time for a couple questions, comments, if you have them. There's one over there. Thank you.
Thank you. Is that hot? Yeah, okay. This is for Rachel. I wonder if, I have no idea if there'd be any evidence for this, but I wonder if you have any thoughts about the intentionality of with what audience you're addressing. If we're performing these plays largely at matinees, there's work out there about how much more of those audiences was composed of women and how that audience space became more subversive. And I wonder if you have any thoughts about whether there's sort of an intentional directive to or conversation with the audience happening.
Thank you. Great question. Sorry, is this on?
Yeah.
So I think the audiences are quite select. If you look at the audience of something like the Independent Theatre Society, it is, at least in the beginning, sort of members only. It's if you know, you know, and that's how you get a ticket. In terms of your question of was she writing to women specifically, I think the work you are probably referring to is something like, is it Catherine Kelly's article saying that something like the matinees of Little Lord Fauntleroy were incredibly dominated by women. I think what is interesting though about Burney and Benham's matinees is that they aren't running for multiple series or matinees of something which is going on to the main bill. These are one-off performances in either private spaces they've secured or theatres that they've managed to rent out. So in that regard, I would say there would definitely be a strong female audience, though I imagine it is of their sort of connections and circles and people who are interested in theatre which can't get a licence from the Lord Chamberlain. Though these people, I'm sure, would probably be more sympathetic to women's rights and women's issues than sort of the average audience you pull off the stage. So I hope that gives you a sense of who this audience is for.
Thank you. Any other questions? Yeah, we'll go one there.
Is it what? Thank you very much for 3 fantastic papers. And well, as a follow-up of this question, I was wondering if part of the audience would be women from women's clubs. And my question was going to be both for Rachel and Amanda, because I'm not so much acquainted with the German tradition, but also you, Magret, because you've got loads. I was fascinated with the amount of archival work that you've, archival material that you've got in your work. So do you think, or do you know, Rachel and Amanda, if your women were members of any women's clubs? And if they were, I would say that part of the audiences of these matinees might be, in your case, Rachel, perhaps women from these women's clubs, in which, because I found out in some of my research these past few months, I've read about, for example, the Pioneer Club and women in the other Pioneer Club being involved in these independent theatre performances. So might you find some networks there? But my question is for the 3 of you. Thank you.
I can quickly answer. Minnie Maddern Fiske, she was guest speaker at some women's clubs, but she was not actively engaged. Most of the women that I study were considered themselves new women, and interestingly, Minnie Maddern Fiske did not. But I still feel that she was very subversive with her letters to her husband, and she was very much, but she didn't have that same network that other women that I'm researching did. So I think that's a really interesting line, but it just doesn't, Minnie Maddern just did not.
Yeah, so another great question, and it's one I've actually have done some thinking about, not specifically for women's clubs, but how the Independent Theatre Society and similar organisations got their membership. And there was definitely a sort of exchange of bulk ticket buying, so something like the Fabian Society, a sort of rally by Shaw, was definitely buying tickets in block, and there was sort of a quid pro quo exchange here. I haven't come across specifically a women's club buying tickets or sort of arranging their own private theatricals, but there have been a lot of literary clubs like the Shelley Society or something like that, which not only are performing works themselves in their own spaces, but trying to engage in these other alternative platforms. I've really enjoyed your work on sort of the 1893 women's clubs and those kind of spaces, and I did try and see if I could find any connections with actually the sort of organisations you talked about in that paper, and unfortunately there weren't. But that isn't to say it doesn't exist, just there is no official paperwork for something like the Independent Theatre Society. It apparently all burned after the Second World War, so it's definitely a possibility, one I can't foreclose, but not one I've concretely found any evidence of.
Thank you.
Yeah, I don't know yet if she was a member of the women's club, but I know that she had an intensive letter correspondence with Ada Christen, a Viennese author and actress, and Ada Christen was part of a women's club, of a literacy club. So there could be a connection, and perhaps she also was a member. But Gallmeyer had a huge network, a social network, including artists, playwrights, other actresses and actors. So it could be that she was a member of such a club, but I can answer it.
Okay, so thanks again to the three of you for the presentation. Let's give them a round of applause.